Thank you, Daniel Pomerantz, for joining us from beautiful Tel Aviv while I record this from Crown Heights, Brooklyn.
No, I actually grew up in Chicago.
Okay.
After I went to law school, I spent my first couple years working in New York. I lived on the Upper East Side and worked at a law firm called Weil, Gotshal and Manges.
Firm.
The thing that kind of ended up inspiring me to make a change in my career was you work so hard to get somewhere in your career. And then you get there. And once you're finally in that law office, you can see the people who are at the top. It's not like some fantasy. They're right there in the corner office. And so I look at the senior partners in the corner offices, and they didn't look terribly happy to me. They looked even more stressed out than I was, and for good reason. It's hard work. But then I thought, why do I want, if I don't even want to get to where they're sitting now, if I don't want that corner office, why am I here? And so I started thinking about making some changes.
Well, that's a great jumping off point because you and I are new to each other. I discovered you on Substack. You just had a great essay today. You're a prolific writer and extremely insightful. And you write from kind of a Jewish American in Israel perspective. You seem to be very comfortable in both societies. So I would love to just hear a little bit more about Reality Check and kind of a brief biography.
Yeah. Grew up in Chicago. I went to law school in Washington, D.C. I worked in New York. And then I finally made Aliyah, immigrated to Israel. And that was about 15 years ago now.
Wow. Mazel tov.
Well, thank you. And so now I feel very comfortable in both places. When I'm here, I feel very Israeli, but I also still feel very connected to American culture and life and news. So a lot of my work involves straddling both of those worlds. And in my work, even though I bring a perspective as being Jewish and American and Israeli, I also try to bring a perspective of just thoughtfulness and common sense, using my law background to explore issues with rigor and with depth, so that by the end, I don't feel that what I write is really an opinion. It's just a deconstruction of what is. And people can make their opinions based on that. But if someone says, oh, X violates international law, and it really doesn't, I'll explain why it doesn't. You can still say X is wrong, but you can't say it violates international law if that's really not the case. So I came here having lived and worked in America, wanting to find something new to do. I wanted to use my legal background because it's a powerful tool and I felt a connection to it, but I didn't want to be practicing law and just helping clients do really cool things, but kind of being on the sideline myself. I felt like I was the helper and they were the ones doing the cool things. So I started Reality Check Research, which is the organization I run now. To describe what we do is easiest by telling a little story. We do research on issues of politics and law and speak to the public and speak to governments, but that doesn't really capture it. Last March, Israel stopped providing humanitarian aid into Gaza. The Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, David Lammy, jumped to announce that was a gross violation of international law and went on and on. And you'd be surprised how many people in government don't always have access to the knowledge resources that they might need to do their jobs. And so I reached out to a few people in different government offices. One of them was the Israeli Prime Minister's office. I provided an essay that I'd put together with just enough legal background to be persuasive, but not so much that you start geeking out and losing people. And also focusing still on the moral and practical aspects. I provide him with this essay. He used it almost word for word in his press conferences. It was so effective that David Lammy ended up having to take back what he said, apologized, and then his boss, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the time, Keir Starmer, publicly admonished him for getting this time entirely wrong. And so that's sort of what we do is we take just the right combination of technical and real world common sense and use it in a way that actually makes a difference in the world.
Well, that's really impressive. It's a great story. I certainly have gotten the gist of that from reading your essays. I really like how you talk about a deconstruction of events where you're not really trying to editorialize, you're trying to kind of analyze them. Analysis comes from the term lysis, like to break things down. And I find that unfortunately rare in the discourse when it comes to Israel or the Middle East from an American perspective. It seems like most mainstream or all mainstream news sources and academic areas in America have such an axe to grind. They have such an agenda that it seems almost impossible for the mainstream media structurally perhaps to really comprehend reality because they have such a bias. And it seems like they're litigating maybe the civil rights movement or slavery or Jim Crow or something like that. And they're applying it to the Middle East, whereas you're really just taking an event and breaking it down and making it clear. You're in a new cohort that's evolved over the past couple of years, like Barry Weiss at the Free Press and other groups. Do you feel like, is that accurate? Or do you feel like you're kind of part of maybe a new movement in the media?
That's such an optimistic way to think of it. And I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think I'm going to for now on because it's an encouraging thought. I just felt like things bothered me. And when things bother you, you need to express it. And if I sit down and write or I speak about it, then I feel better. I don't sit there continuing to feel bothered. Jordan Peterson has this phrase where he says, if you want to make a difference in the world, start by asking what bothers you, because that's your call to action. And I was just doing that because it felt like the right thing to do. But I think we're learning, number one, that there are a lot of other people who do it. And number two, that there are an even greater number of people who crave it, who want to listen to it. So that tells you something about maybe something positive about the direction our world is going in. I just thought of a really positive thing today. We're going to talk about a lot of negative things.
No,
So
let's be positive. We're heading into the new year. It's good to be positive.
I learned this fact. Friends and The Office, the beloved television shows, and not just by the generation that saw them when they were new, but now a whole new generation is watching them. When they came out on Netflix, they were the highest rated or the most streamed television programs on Netflix. Now, people who are responsible for creating those shows, the creators, some of the lead actors, they've spoken a number of times over the years about how those shows could never get made today. It's just there's a different political climate, a sense of what's politically correct or woke, and you just couldn't get the project greenlit and people wouldn't accept it. And yet, this project, which could never get made today, is one of the most viewed projects today. So what does that tell you? Number one, there's obviously a gap between people who are greenlighting projects in the studios versus the audience. But it also tells you that there's a gap between what we think everyone believes versus what people's behavior actually demonstrates.
Yeah, that's really well said and well observed. I think you're right. They couldn't do a show like that because it's not diverse enough or has enough trans characters or queer narratives or whatever it is that they feel like is missing. Um, I find that kind of frustrating. But you're right. The audience is voting with their eyeballs, and hopefully that sends a message. I've certainly been encouraged by your writing, by the Free Press, by Commentary Magazine, by Dan Senor, um, Haviv Rettig-Gur, and many other podcasters and writers. It seems like Substack is sort of enabling this new ecosystem to evolve, and you're a part of it. Let's kind of get into what you wrote about today. Um, tell us a little bit about what you wrote today and how it fits into this kind of wider narrative.
Yeah, well, Hamas, which you remember Hamas? They used to exist.
Yeah.
turns out they still do, and they're still working to get themselves armed. They're still probing Israeli defenses. They still control portions of central Gaza, and they've restarted a practice that they originally had started in 2018, which was launching weaponized kites and balloons. In some cases, they're incendiary. They have material that catches fire. In some cases, they actually have explosives on them. Now, when Israel responded to these incendiary projectiles over the last few years, sometimes Israel got accused of war crimes, including by the United Nations, saying it's a war crime because you're not allowed to attack somebody unless, and they put out these certain very limited restrictive situations under international law, but they're wrong because that's not actually what international law says. What international law says is that if you go out and engage in battle, engage in attacks, which is what you're doing when you launch an explosive projectile against Israeli civilian communities, you're not a civilian. And it doesn't matter if you have a uniform, it doesn't matter if you have a rank. If you are engaged in attack, you, by definition, are not a civilian anymore. That's what the Geneva Conventions say. So Hamas recruits people, a lot of times, unfortunately, young people, to fight, to send off these explosive kites. And technically, that means they're not civilians. And the expectation is that Israel shouldn't be responding to it. The problem is, if Israel doesn't respond, then you have people blowing up Israeli communities with projectile explosives. And what should be really chilling to us right now is that 4 of the kites that landed in Israel, so far, these new ones, they're not armed yet. So Israel's security services think it's sort of probing before taking the next step. But 4 of these kites had strings that were several miles long. And so ask yourself, where have you heard of that before? And the answer is fiber optic drones. That's what we see in Ukraine and in Russia. It's also what Hezbollah has been using in Lebanon. You can't jam the signal of a drone if it has a fiber optic cable and it's getting the signal physically through a wire. So that makes these especially dangerous, and they've been very devastatingly effective, both in the war in Ukraine and Russia, and also in Lebanon, where the IDF's been fighting the Hezbollah terror organization. So this is just terrifying to Israelis, because we see that the next step might be fiber optic drones heading not toward IDF soldiers in Lebanon, but towards civilian communities in southern Israel near the Gaza border. So Israel issued a warning saying, this has got to stop right away. If it doesn't stop, we're going to evacuate civilians from the areas where these are being fired, and we're going to take military action against Hamas in those areas. The world is about to jump up and down and say, war crimes, you're attacking children for flying kites. But the problem is, this is why, when I say if you attack, you're no longer a civilian, when I talk about international law, I'm not just talking about technicalities. The laws that we have are designed to, they at least aspire to capture our values. They don't always succeed perfectly, but that's the idea. And the value here is that if all you have to do is take off your uniform and nobody can shoot back at you, or if all you have to do is recruit a person from your local community and no one can shoot at them, then you've created a situation where you can attack someone with impunity, and they are legally required, literally, to die, to let you kill them, and they can't do anything back. And so international law and common sense demands that if someone starts engaging in an attack, they cannot be treated as a civilian anymore, because no matter who's shooting at you, you have to be able to shoot back. And if terrorists are using otherwise civilians or children to do this, that's a terrible thing that terrorists are doing to their community, but the solution isn't to let Israeli communities die. And it gets even worse, because under international law, if you attack someone, you lose your civilian status. That makes you a combatant. Or combatant can be a strong word, because if you're not part of a regular army, if you're a terrorist, you're actually less than a combatant. You don't have the rights that a combatant has if you're, say, a prisoner of war. But you're either a combatant or what's called an illegal combatant. But if you attack and you're not attacking soldiers, but you're specifically attacking civilian communities, that makes you a war criminal. And I'm not talking about when a civilian dies by accident, or where you're trying to hit a terror site and there were civilians nearby. There are numerous aspects of the Geneva Conventions that say that is not a war. But if your target, if your goal is to intentionally destroy a civilian community, that makes you both not a civilian and a war criminal. And that's what right now, what we see coming out of Gaza is these little probes, these little tests, kites that aren't armed yet. But we're heading toward a situation where Israel is going to have to respond to this. And you heard it here first. This is what the world is going to say about it.
For keen observers of global affairs, by now in 2026, seeing a kite fly into territory, especially with a string miles long, with the history of incendiary kites, and it's just either a low-tech drone or a precursor to an actual attack. I think your analysis, as usual, is spot on. The problem, Daniel, is that you're asking for the UN or the authoritative media sources in America, diplomats, to actually have standards that equally apply to Israel as they do to the rest of the world. So it's, from an Israeli or from a Jewish perspective, we've we've long noted that all of the wars against Israel have always been genocidal. They've never were just like one army versus another army. They've always just been to kill every single Jewish person. All of the attacks from Hamas, from Hezbollah, from Iran, they all target civilians. They're not a classic military objectives. They just want to kill as many Jews as possible. It seems like the kites are just part of that, and that's the war crime. But there just is an incredible inversion in popular narratives in America where everything is inverted. Jews, Israel is accused of genocide. Israel is accused of just indiscriminate carpet bombing or whatever of civilians just because they're Arabs or Palestinians or whatever. I'm wondering if I feel like you've observed this inversion for a long time, and if you have any thoughts about it or any ideas, if it's possible for that narrative to actually change.
Yeah, it is possible. It's not easy. But the example of what we accomplished with the British Foreign Secretary is one example of that. Sometimes you just need one right person in front of the right camera at the right moment, and you can make a real difference. And by the way, if anyone listening is in that position, whether you're talking to your communities or if you're a government official or whatever, everything I say when I cite international law or any factual assertion I make, I've always written about it and provided links to the specific areas of law or specific articles that support what I'm saying. So if this is something you're going to go out and talk about, I assume in the show notes we'll have links to what I put on Substack and also to our website. And we also have an artificial intelligence platform. We call it RC Answers, and the link is on our website also. So you could check my Substack, or you could also just go on to my AI platform, and the platform's trained on our work. So you could just ask whatever you would ask me 24 hours a day and get an answer, including these citations. So I might say Geneva Conventions, but in my work, you'll get the specific chapter and verse and a link.
It is persuasive.
How did it come about? And the answer is it's not so organic. It's discouraging and very easy to think, wow, just the young people in the world and everything has just gone this direction. It didn't just go this direction. Where I see the inception was the Durban Conference in 2001, which is the United Nations Conference Against Racism, which ironically included Nazi swastikas and people holding marches and shouting chants and Der Stürmer cartoons and all this stuff that is actually quite racist. And at that conference, a number of partners got together, the Palestinian Authority government, Iran, Qatar, and others, and also a whole bunch of groups linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. And they put together what they later ended up calling the diplomatic intifada, which was to decrease the strength of Israel, of the United States, and generally of the West in every possible form. Academics, you name it, news media, everything they can approach. And social media came out later, and of course that became a big component of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's working. They were targeting, this was a long-term plan. They were targeting what is now the 18 to 24 cohort, which at the time, that demographic was just being born. And so they were thinking ahead, and we didn't really think about dealing with that. I think we had a sense, certainly in Israel, and generally in the West, that, well, it's just a bunch of people saying stuff, it doesn't really matter. But we've seen this before. This was the Soviet political warfare, and it worked. They turned entire countries, spread the communist revolution around the world by using disinformation, misinformation, building grassroots groups, providing military support, and then turning entire countries. And that's what we're seeing now. It's a long-term, well-funded, well-thought-out plan. You have to think of this the way you would think of any branch of your armed forces. You got your Army, Navy, Marines, and you've got to have communications at those same levels. And if you don't, you're going up against someone who does. It would be like getting out into a rowboat with a rifle and going against a Navy. It just doesn't work. So there's a lot we can accomplish, but we also need our governments to step up and fund this properly. In the meantime, all the work I do is funded by private donations. We're a 501c3, we're a nonprofit. We don't get government funding at all. Maybe we will someday if they get wise. But people do step up and support this. So what we're seeing is not entirely organic. But I want to be cautious about implying that this means that all the people saying these things about the world, Israel and the Middle East, but also a lot of other topics as well. I want to be cautious about saying that people don't actually believe it. There's a concept in the algorithms on social media platforms that you put up a post and immediately the platform looks to see how many people are engaging with it right off the bat. And if that number is high, then it will start sharing the post more broadly and widely, and that's how you start going viral. And in fact, people who try to manipulate this, there was a scandal that came out of the New York mayor's office just recently that some of Mamdani's posts, he had these bots that you hire these fake users to engage with his post initially, because once you get that first kickstart, the algorithm picks it up and spreads it around. And the reason algorithms work that way is because human behavior works that way. We have these ideas that are kind of not very sensical, that violate common sense, that violate law, that violate anything that if you really think it through thoughtfully, you realize it doesn't make sense. But these ideas get out there, and the initial people who spread them might be cynical, might have an agenda, but then they start spreading a little wider and other people hear about it, and they don't check into it very closely. They get captured in an emotional way, and then it does spread to lots of people who genuinely believe it, even though they didn't really check it very carefully.
Yeah, that's a great description of the kind of phenomena of virality. And then if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes credible. What I'm noticing a little bit in British politics and certainly in America is that only one of the two political movements between liberals and conservatives are susceptible to these kind of crazy inversions and ridiculous narratives, like that all Muslims are oppressed is one of the, or that Black people aren't capable of racism and discrimination, like they're not regular people or something. Only white people can do these things, and these kind of crazy reductive binaries of, like in a Star Wars movie, of good versus evil. And it seems like the left in America, even from the establishment, very moderate, intelligent people, to far left extremists in the progressive side, they're very susceptible to these narratives and these lies. I'm not seeing that susceptibility from people who don't consider themselves part of liberal culture, more on the right or politically homeless, the red green alliance, they call it. Red for communism and green for Islam. And then that's sort of a pun, maybe, because there's the Green Party in England and in Europe, which is started as an ecological environmental movement, which has now kind of become hardcore progressive. Why? It's a big question, but do you agree with me that there's a susceptibility, a gullibility, or there's some kind of something wrong intellectually on the left for the Middle East? Like, genocidal terrorists are the good guys, and a country defending itself, its borders, from horrific, savage barbarians' attacks, they're the bad guys. And it's like if you had the Sinaloa cartel attack Texas and start mass rapes and beheadings and all the horrific stuff from October 7th, it would not, I don't think people would think of it that way. I think we would defend our borders and it would be brutal, and hopefully America would win. Why is this happening? Why is the left so susceptible to these kind of distortions?
Yeah, there's some subtlety here. I agree that this sort of, what would you call it, movement, philosophy, mind frame has certainly had more success on the left so far. But we also do see that sort of horseshoe effect that they talk about, that you see on the right, anti-Semitism. You're seeing increasing amounts of even young conservatives being drawn to socialism on the right. So you are starting to see some of these things happen. You got your sort of Tucker Carlson crowd. Now, Tucker Carlson is not mainstream in the Republican Party. He's niche and apparently now starting his own party, and doesn't enjoy nearly as much support as, say, the president or the mainstream Republican figures. Whereas on the Democrat side, you have either the mainstream figures are at worst actually supporting this, or at the very least are paying lip service to it because they're afraid that if they don't, they'll lose their position. So you have someone like, say, Chuck Schumer will sort of make these head nods to this philosophy, and then you have other people who are more say, forceful about it. Bernie Sanders, AOC, Mamdani, some of these new candidates like Abdul Saeed, who's running for the Senate seat in Michigan. And that sort of seems to be the mainstream direction of the party. So we see it on both sides, but certainly in one party it's more mainstream, whereas in another party it's, at least for now, niche. It's an important distinction because it means you can't be blasé about this. If you're in the Republican Party, you need to be diligent about making sure your party doesn't go that direction. And if you're a lifelong Democrat and you believe in the Democrats, well, you've got your work cut out for you. And I'm not going to say you shouldn't be a Democrat, but there are some things that you should do to get your party on the right track. But in terms of why it would work better on the left, and we see this throughout history, the Soviet Revolution was a left-wing movement. People forget that the Nazi Party, Nazi stands for National Socialist Workers' Party. It was a working class socialist party, not a right-wing party. And it may be, and I'm stepping a little out of my lane here because I'm not a professional psychologist, but apparently the research shows that people who tend to be on the left tend to be higher in a trait called compassion, and people on the right tend to be higher in a trait called conscientiousness. So if you're into compassion, you're really trying to do the right thing, and sort of technical details kind of get in the way of that because right is right and moral is moral. Whereas if you're high in conscientiousness, you're going to be someone who takes a step back and says, well, wait, let's think this through and make sure that we're getting all the facts and the details correct. And in the right balance, there's room for both of those things in the world, because you don't want to get so technical that you do something that's technically right but actually hurts people. But on the other hand, you don't want to be so divorced from reality that you do what you think is right without checking about whether it actually is right. And a good example of that is people just hear this word genocide, genocide, genocide. Well, we can all agree genocide is bad. So if you heard that Israel's committing genocide, then that's bad and Israel's bad. But did you actually check to see if that's true? And to me, there's all sorts of arguments about that, but to me, the most obvious and persuasive one is that there are these countries suing Israel in the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, over accusing Israel of genocide, which is really just, it's a cruel irony because Israel helped create the ICJ in its early years in 1948 as a statement that Israel is taking a role in the world to prevent what just happened to us, a genocide and the Holocaust, and we're taking part in building these world institutions. And now it's been weaponized against Israel. But what's most telling to me, put all the other arguments aside, that Ireland, which is one of the parties trying to sue Israel, made a motion with the court asking the judges to literally, I kid you not, change the definition of the word genocide in order to make it apply to Israel. And some of these bodies that monitor hunger wanted to change the definition of the word famine in order to make that apply to Gaza. And so when you see people changing the meaning of the words, to me, or to anyone who's being thoughtful, it says, well, tell me you don't have a case without telling me you don't have a case, right? I'm accusing you of X. By the way, let's change the meaning of the word X. But if you're not really thinking it through, you might say, well, right is right, and I'm not going to let something as silly as a definition get in the way of that. And that's these two different modes of thinking that we see at odds with each other, I think.
That's absolutely fascinating. I've never thought about it like this kind of balancing between compassion and conscientiousness. In Judaism, we talk about Hashem, the word we use for God, being a God of justice and also a God of mercy. And balancing the two of those is kind of critical and complicated. And I never thought to apply that to the political spectrums. I find that really very convincing as someone who came from the compassion world. And now I guess I find myself more in the conscientious world, but ideally we have a balance. It seems like more of a Jewish phenomena, but we call ourselves politically homeless because we don't want to be on either extreme. We want to have a sense of equanimity and a sense of balance between these things. I think they made a wrong turn after the civil rights movement. That kind of defined the Democratic Party and popular narratives correctly. It was great. the civil rights legislation in the 1960s passed with bipartisan majorities. So clearly it was like nationally popular. Our country went through a big shift, thankfully. The left continues to kind of litigate the civil rights movement, and it creates all these kind of crazy distortions where you have oppressors and marginalized people, and then you have people saying things like queers for Palestine. And um, it's this dedication to identities and this idea of group identities and this narrative of oppression can justify the most crazy ways of apprehending reality. And I just kind of find it very frustrating that the left doesn't seem to have any capacity for critical thinking or insight. I know you've written about critical thinking before, and I found that so important. I just feel like they have abandoned critical thinking. And I just find it very challenging to have any sense of credibility. If they don't have any ability to think critically, why should I listen to them about anything?
Well, I sometimes just call critical thinking thinking, because if you're not doing that, what are you doing? And one of the things I wrote in that essay is a motto I live by is, how they say don't believe everything you hear. I also live by don't believe everything you think. Just because I have an idea in my head doesn't mean it's true. So you got to explore that. And I write in that essay about how I kind of embarrassed myself in law school, this is many years ago, when I made a statement in front of the class, and the professor didn't say, that's wrong. She said, where did you get the idea that X, what I had said? And I stopped and thought, and I realized I have no idea why I think that's true. Maybe I heard it somewhere, but I don't know. And that's a problem. And so now, even when I'm writing, I might start writing something. And then as I go back to find the links and do the research, I might realize that what I thought was correct actually kind of isn't. So I have to change what I'm writing based on the reality that I'm discovering as I write. Which, by the way, writing's a great exercise, even if you're not publishing. If you care about an issue, write about it. Don't even send it to anyone if you don't want to. Writing is thinking, and it gets us thinking. And the problem with not thinking is that a lot of liberals have abandoned liberal values, and liberal values are important.
Right.
And a good and really ironic example of this is that you remember that a little while ago Trump was pulling funding from Harvard and Columbia and some of these other schools. What was his legal basis for doing this? And this is where I come back to, law isn't just about technicalities. It is an embodiment of our underlying values. What was the legal basis? It was Title VI of the American Civil Rights Act, the sort of foundational cornerstone of liberal thought. Jews are being excluded from campus life, physically not allowed into buildings, hunted and physically attacked, pushed out of open conversations within class. That's a violation of civil rights. You would think if anyone would be jumping on that, it should be people who value liberal values. So you find those ironies when you don't think. You could kind of let go of your own values. And it's a shame because the world needs those values, especially right now.
The contemporary left has become illiberal in form and content, from the cancel culture to just kind of turning a blind eye. And then the irony is that it's the Trump administration using the civil rights movement legislation to try to enforce protection of minority students on campuses, but the left in America rejects that and says it's all just a power grab and cynical. And Jamie Raskin is questioning all of it now. If the Democrats retake the majority in the House, and I just find that kind of proves my point that I think that the American left is kind of irredeemable at this point, and it needs a total makeover. I say this because I want balance. We should have political dialogue. We should have debate. We should have earnest people who disagree with each other, all trying to collaborate in some way. Like that's the whole point of America. And I just feel like the left has kind of excluded themselves from that process by sort of demonizing anybody who disagrees with them. While we go to close, I'm curious about what you're thinking about now and what you're looking forward to. I know we have American midterm elections coming up and obviously Israeli elections coming up.
Well, in terms of the elections, I think I'll tell you something about what I see in Israel and what I see in America. In Israel, Americans are surprised to learn that the issues that divide us here are not whether to attack Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran.
Right.
That's a
Right.
consensus issue. Left, right, and center, the opinions are consensus, and every major candidate running for office who might potentially be prime minister holds the same opinion on that. Even American government officials were apparently surprised by that. That the morals and ethics of the IDF is a consensus issue where there is not disagreement. Whether to create a Palestinian state, which Israelis vastly supported years ago and now no longer do, because the feeling in Israel after October 7th is we just saw what a Palestinian state looks like.
Yeah.
And at least for now, we can't afford that particular danger. And most of the Arab world feels the same. The Arab world very much wants a Palestinian state as long as it's far away from them. Like the old Fiddler on the Roof expression, may God bless the Tsar and keep the Tsar far away from me. And this is not my opinion. This is the opinion of the Arab world.
Yeah.
And so these are consensus issues here. And when people criticize the policies of the Netanyahu government, if you're criticizing a policy that Israelis left, right, and center support, it's sort of like saying, well, I'm not anti-America. I just hate FDR for that policy of fighting Hitler. It's like, no, you got a problem with fighting Hitler, you got a problem with America. That was a consensus policy. And so we do have a number of issues that divide us, but it's not those particular issues. It's the sort of local issues that really affect us. In America, I think we're heading toward something that will be revealing in November. You know, I look at Michigan where Abdul al-Said, who's this very Muslim Brotherhood backed, very virulently anti-Israel, anti-Semitic. He says he's not anti-Semitic, but it's one of those, some of my best friends are Jewish. I'm not
Yeah, right. Tokenism.
Yeah. Well, and it's, you know, it's a measure of if you say I object to Israel's government policies, but the policies you object to are actually a lie, like Israel commits genocide. If your objection is a lie, that's not a criticism of a policy. That's a lie. And now you're going down the path of actually being racist toward a group of people, especially when those lies cause American Jews to be hitting record-breaking numbers of per capita. Jews are more targeted than any other group in America, by not even by a little, by far, and it's much more than before. So if you're telling lies and the lies are getting people attacked and killed, yeah, that's the theater of anti-Semitism. But I saw something that seems like it might be a sliver of something encouraging, maybe, that in El-Said's campaign, they did a poll between El-Said versus the Republican candidate and also his Democratic opponent before they had the primaries, and the Republican opponent. And what they found was his opponent, who's a mainstream pro-Israel Democrat, so she lost to El-Said, but in the polls, it appears she would have beaten the Republican in the general, whereas the polls right now show El-Said not beating the Republican in the general. And now there's 3 months to go. Anything could happen. Polls aren't always right. But let's just assume that there maybe is some insight in this number. What that tells us is that it may be that what is popular in a primary or popular in a specific locality like New York City, which elected Mamdani, may not be popular in a general election or in a statewide election. Now, my hope is that maybe things really do go that direction. Some of the more extreme candidates lose when they start getting into statewide or national elections, and the Republican Party wakes up and realizes that they're actually shooting themselves in the foot. And what they thought was this exciting cause that gets everyone fired up is actually causing them to lose elections.
I think that is the hope, and we'll see. We'll see. It's going to be a very telling end of the year for both countries. And I encourage my listeners to subscribe to Reality Check and to follow Daniel. I want to thank you so much for your time today. I hope you continue writing, and I want to wish you a Shana Tova.
Thank you. So happy to do it. And thanks for having me. And Shana Tova.